Hey everyone, this is Alex Millar, aka Kanu7 for upswingpoker.com, and this is going to be the second video of a mini-series I've been making for Upswing, which is looking at monotone flops. And in the last video, if you haven't watched the first video, I'd recommend watching that first. That was about c-betting on monotone flops, and in particular why we don't want to put in as much money when we're c-betting on monotone flops as we do on other flops. So in this video, I'm going to look at playing versus c-bets on monotone flops, and I'm going to have a look in particular at whether or not we see the same thing again. Are we reluctant to put in as much money check raising as we on monotone flops as we are on other flops? So let's take a look. Now, if we go into the private solver that I showed briefly last time, then I mentioned last time, but just a reminder that the solver calculates bet sizes itself, so you don't just give it a couple of bet sizings and it uses those. While it's iterating, it's also iterating the bet sizes and comes to what it decides are the best bet sizes. So that's why you see a wide variety of bet sizings here. But this is currently filtered for just any flops versus a c-bet and versus any size as well. So overall, over this pretty decent sample, we see that we are folding 45% of the time across all boards versus all different sizes, and we're calling 44% of the time. So that leaves us check raising 11% of the time as sort of a normal check raise percentage versus some sort of random c-bet on a random board. And you can see as well that we use a wide variety of different sizings, going from even some as small as quarter pot check raise, going up to about pot check raise. And we even have a few going a little bit bigger than that, but not enough to get up to 1% overall. Now, if we filter for monotone flops, we're going to see immediately something quite different. So here on monotone flops, we're folding 41% of the time and calling 53% of the time, leaving us check raising just 6% of the time. So that's 5% less often than across all the boards, and that's despite the fact that we're tending to face pretty small sizings on monotone flops compared to average. So something that would normally make us check raise more often, facing small sizings, still isn't enough to actually make us check raise quite a lot on monotone flops. So the answer is yes, we are actually putting in less money again on monotone flops in terms of check raising, just like we were when we were deciding whether to c-bet or not in position. So we have two approaches, as I said in the last video, to explain this. And the first one is to look at how the ranges match up versus each other, and that's very relevant here again, but we looked over that in a lot of detail in the last video. So in this video, I'm going to focus on the second thing that we want to look at, which is which is the incentives of individual hands and whether they're more inclined to want to check raise or check call and so on. So let's get into that. To do this, I'm going to think about the marginal hands which, could potentially check raise, could potentially check call, and look at their incentives. Would they prefer to check raise? Would they prefer to check call? And in order to work this out, I think something that's extremely helpful in a lot of situations when thinking about betting or raising is to split things into two. So first of all, we want to think about how our hand does, or what our hand's incentives are to play against villains' hands that are continuing versus a bet or raise. And then secondly, you want to think about what your incentives are with your hand to bet or raise against the hands that your opponent is folding. So let's start with the hands that our opponent will be continuing versus a raise in this case. And let's think about a hand like two pair from our side. So on a normal flop, which isn't monotone, a hand like two pair has pretty damn good equity against our opponent's continuing range. Our opponent's probably going to be continuing a bunch of high card hands, which need runner to outdraw our two pair, or just weaker pairs, which even if they hit two pair, it'll be weaker than our two pair, and so on. So they have really very few outs, just a couple of outs to trips. We'll have some stronger pairs, which maybe have up to 5 outs or so versus our two pair. Maybe they'll have some sort of straight draw some of the time. But that's the sort of range that we're looking at when our opponent continues. Of course, sometimes our opponent will have a stronger hand entirely, which we've got poor equity against. But overall, our two pair's going to have very good equity against our opponent's continue range. And even if you think of a hand a bit weaker, like something like top pair, then still our opponent's got a bunch of hands that are going to be continuing against top pair that only really have a few outs to outdraw it, or maybe even need runner. So that's the sort of normal flop. And if we take things onto a monotone flop though, and think about two pair, then our opponent has actually got a ton of flush draws that they're going to be continuing with. If I bring in a particular example here, so this is a 6-4-3 monotone flop, and our opponent has c-bet just over half pot, and this is our range. So I'm just going to go over quickly what you're looking at in terms of the solver. So anything, well, perhaps the best thing is to say, first of all, we've got all the different cards down the left. So we've got ace of spades, ace of hearts, ace of diamonds, ace of clubs, king of spades, etc. And then across the top, we've got the same things. So we've got ace of spades, ace of hearts, ace of diamonds, etc. So each little square here is a combination. So this combination here is king of diamonds, jack of diamonds. If I move along, this one is king of diamonds, nine of spades, and so on. And the color scheme is that blue is fold. So if we have something like king of diamonds, 10 of diamonds, we're folding 100% of the time. If we have something like king of diamonds, 10 of spades with the flush draw, we have it green, and green is always call. So calling here 100% of the time with this hand. And then if we have something yellow, so this is mostly yellows, a little bit green in there. This is 7 of spades, 5 of spades for the straight flush, and we would be raising this 88% of the time and calling it 12% of the time. So that's what the color scheme is, that's what you're looking at. But back to my explanation then. So when we check raise, so this is us versus a c-bet. If we click through so that we've check raised, now we're seeing how our opponent's playing versus the check raise. And if we hover over our opponent's call range, they're calling 44% of the time, and then we move across here to hover over flush draws. This number here by the side tells us what percentage of our opponent's range is made up of flush draws. So 54% of our opponent's call range versus our check raise is made up of flush draws. And each one of those 54% of our opponent's range, each hand in that range has at least 9 outs versus our 2-pair. So our 2-pair really has quite poor equity versus a bunch of hands that it might be ahead of at the moment. So in terms of our incentive to raise versus our opponent's continue range, if the higher our equity is versus our opponent's continue range, the more inclined we are to raise. So the best way to think about this perhaps is that we know that our opponent's continuing these hands. We're just looking at our opponent's continue range at the moment. If we've got 100% equity versus that range, then of course we are going to want to raise our hand. Absolutely. We want to build the pot as big as possible and have a bunch of hands continue versus that raise that we know they're continuing. So absolutely fantastic, the more equity we've got. As our equity goes down, we're less and less keen to check raise versus the continue range. You know, if we went all the way down, so we actually have 0% equity and versus our opponent's continue range, then obviously we do not want to check raise a hand with 0% equity when we know that our opponent's continuing. So it just goes all the way down. We're more and more inclined to check raise the more equity we've got against our opponent's continue range, and we're less and less inclined to check raise the less equity we've got. And when we've got 2-pair on a board like this, a monotone board, we've actually got really poor equity compared to what we normally have, even compared to say something like top pair on a different board. Looking at the other side of things, so our equity versus our opponent's fold range, now if we've got really good equity against our opponent's fold range, that makes us less inclined to want to check raise. And I think the best way to think about this is imagine that we have really bad equity versus our opponent's folding range. Then that's absolutely fantastic news for us if we check raise. We check raise, our opponent is folding a bunch of hands with good equity against us. You know, that's brilliant. If we've got really good equity, so imagine again we're in the spot where we've got 100% equity versus our opponent's fold range. Now that's really bad news if we're check raising and all these hands which have 0 equity against us are folding. We'd much rather, remember, just against those hands that are folding, we'd much rather check call and potentially have those hands barrel the turn or hit something and put some more money in versus us on a future street. You're probably thinking, okay, sure, but then don't things kind of move together? And often they do. You know, if we've got a hand with really good equity, it's generally got good equity against our opponent's continue range and also even better equity versus their fold range. And if we've got a hand with weaker equity, then weaker hand, it's going to have less equity against our opponent's continue range, but it's probably also going to have less equity against our opponent's fold range, and things roughly kind of even themselves out. But in this particular example, if we think about our opponent's fold range, it's actually nowhere near the same extent of sort of worse equity with a hand like 2-pair. Our opponent's still got a bunch of high card hands. Yes, they're going to fold a few flush draws, but probably not actually that many. They might fold a few straight draws and a few weak pairs, but these hands don't really have a ton of outs versus our 2-pair compared to the flush draws that are continuing. I mean, some of them have, of the few flush draws they are continuing, they're folding, sorry, obviously still have 9 outs, but the other hands don't. And then our opponent's still going to have just this bunch of hands that have basically no equity versus 2 pair still that are folding. So if we hover over our opponent, I've now got back into our opponent's range versus our check raise. And if we hover over the fold range, we can see here that they've got about 7% of their range being 1 pair, but they're all weak pairs. Don't have a ton of outs versus our 2 pairs still. And then 6.2% is a flush draw. So again, just a few hands really compared to the 50%, 54% that we had in the continue range. And then we've got a few open-enders, just 5%. So again, not too significant. And 12% gut shots, which, have 4 outs versus our 2 pairs, but still not a ton of outs compared to the 9 we're talking about in the continue range. But then if we go into high card hands, no flush draw, no straight draw, we can see that 71% of our opponent's fold range has basically no equity versus 2 pair. They need runner to outdraw us. So yeah, we have this situation. I've now got back to our range again, but we now have this situation where our hands like 2 pair have way worse incentives to check raise than they would on other boards in terms of playing against the continue range of our opponent, but things haven't really changed that much versus the opponent's fold range compared to a different situation. So yeah, we're just really putting those two things together. Overall, we're just far less inclined to want to check raise with a hand like 2 pair on a monotone flop. And that also holds true not just for 2 pair, but if you think something like a straight, if we have 7-5 with no spade, we have exactly the same phenomenon, that our opponent has 54% their range having 9 outs versus our straight. So not very inclined to check raise that either. Even something like a weak flush, if we have, say, 9-8 of spades, then our opponent still has a big chunk of hands that have a higher spade than that can outdraw us. In fact, if we go back into our opponent's range versus our check raise, then if we hover over, let's go into versus when our opponent calls. So we've got the 54% flush draws here. And if we open this up, we can see that 17% of our opponent's entire range is made up of hands which have the ace of spades in them. So even if we have a king high flush draw, our opponent still has loads of outs versus, even if we have a king high flush, our opponent still has a bunch of outs to outdraw our king high flush because they've got so many hands with the ace of spades. And then as our flush gets lower, they've also got so they've got the 17% of hands with the ace of spades. They've also got 9% of their range having the king of spades, and then 7% having the queen of spades, and so on. So as our flush gets lower, we just got more and more. Our opponent's got more and more hands with good outs versus us. So yeah, hands like 2 pair, straights, and even weak flushes just have way worse equity than top end hands normally do on other boards. So they're less inclined to check raise. When I say they have far less equity versus our opponent's continue range, I mean, obviously. So yeah, while still having good equity against our opponent's fold range. So yeah, less inclined to check raise. Even if we think about something like the nut flush, then of course this doesn't have the problem of having poor equity. Nut flushes still have very good equity, but they still have a blocker problem. So this is a problem that our weak flushes have as well, that when so much of our opponent's continue range contains a spade, and when we're check raising a top end hand, we obviously want our opponent to be continuing as much as possible, then we actually don't, the blockers are working against us here. We're blocking a bunch of hands that our opponent's going to continue. If we have 2 spades in our hand, then a bunch of weaker hands our opponent would normally be continuing, they can't have because we have those cards. So our opponent's going to have a higher fold percentage when we check raise a flush than they will if we check raise, say, a straight or something. So yeah, all in all, just bad incentives to check raise with a bunch of our, well, pretty much all of our strong hands, and we end up not really doing it very often. You can actually see in this particular example on the 6-4-3, we can hover over 2 pair here and see that we're actually check raising 0% of the time. We're always check calling if we have a hand like 6-4. So yeah, just a really clear check call here. The incentives are so strong that we're not even going to be check raising 2% of the time or something. The same thing if we have a straight. So you can see again here, we've got 7-5. We never have a spade with 7-5 because we don't have 7-5 offsuit. So if we have 7-5 of spades, that's obviously the straight flush. But if we just have a straight, then never check raising with a straight. And then if we go into our flushes, you see again, overall, across all the flushes, then we are check calling 80% of the time and only check raising 20%. So if you're someone who, flops a flush on a monotone board out of position and gets a bit excited and your opponent c-bets and you're just like, quick, get in the check raise, then that's not actually how you should be playing. Obviously, if your opponent is c-betting way too often on monotone boards, then you want to check raise more often. But if your opponent's playing well, it's actually a spot where you want to be check calling an absolute ton of even your top end hands. One somewhat interesting thing to note is that trips do tend to check raise a little bit more often. So even when we're not check raising any two pairs, not check raising any straights, we're going to be check raising some trips. And you may have already worked out why, congratulations if so, but it's because trips do have better equity than these other hands because they have quite a lot of outs to outdraw other hands. So if our opponent has a flush and they c-bet and we have trips, we have a bunch of outs to hit a full house. If our opponent has some sort of flush draw, so that's bad news for us, but also if our opponent does hit the flush, we've still got the redraw outs. So, and trips obviously have a lot more outs than two pair do. So that's why we're still seeing check raising trips sometimes, but overall you can see just low check raise percentages on these boards. And I should say that it's not always the case that it's actually 0% check raise with, say, straights and two pairs. So there's an example on a King Jack 10 monotone board where our opponent is c-betting a smaller size, and also on a King Jack 10, both players have less flushes because the King, the Jack, and the 10 are high flush cards. Both players are going to have more high flush cards in their range than low ones. So when both players have less flushes, the flush effects become a little bit less significant, and therefore we still end up, and added to the fact that we're facing a smaller c-bet size, we still end up being able to check raise sometimes with two pairs and straights there, but it's still only sometimes. Most of the time we're still check calling. So the overall concept is very important and universal across all monotone flops. You're never going to find a monotone flop, button versus big blind, where you just want to be check raising all your two pairs and loving life. Not going to happen. So yeah, that's I think going to be good. So let's bring in some PowerPoint conclusions here, because it's obviously nice to understand the concepts, but we need to know what our strategy is actually going to be. So we can have a default strategy of check raising half pot with our frequency being around 5% versus third pot c-bets and going down to 0% versus three-quarter pot c-bets. If we go into our solver, so let's close this up, you can see anything from this one I've selected downwards is facing third pot c-bet or bigger. So versus third pot c-bet, we've got 3%, 5%, 5%, 6%, etc. So around about 5% is a pretty decent starting point to have a default for check raise percentage versus third pot c-bets, and then that just on average goes down as the sizing we face gets bigger. And then we have this example on a versus a three-quarters pot bet where it's 0% check raise, and I'm sure it wouldn't be 0% on every monotone flop versus three-quarters pot, but I think, do we really want to bother putting in some sort of 1% check raise range? I think we're going to be fine just versus a big c-bet on a monotone flop. We don't need to be check raising. And yeah, half pot sizing is, go back into it. Half pot sizing, almost always using half pot sizing versus these slightly bigger c-bet sizings. A couple of times using a bit smaller, one time using a bit bigger, but half pot's going to be a good default again. When we do face a really small c-bet on monotone flop, so if we're facing a quarter pot c-bet, then we can actually move the frequency up to 10%. But bear in mind, it was still 15% of the time or so across all the boards versus that sort of size c-bet. So we're still check raising less often than normal, but by quite a bit. But yeah, we do at least start to have some sort of reasonable check raising range if we're facing a small flop c-bet. And we also want to move the sizing down to a third pot for our check raise. So you can see these top 5 are all versus quarter pot, roughly c-bets. So we've got a couple using third pot, a couple using quarter pot, and one using half pot. So around third pot's going to work out just fine there. And then the final thing is just to say, remember that we rarely want to check raise with two pairs or straights, and we even check call a hell of a lot with flushes. So don't be someone who is just leaving your range far too weak when you are on a monotone flop, leaving your sort of check call range far too weak, and also just check raising a bunch of hands that actually would have played better if you check called them. So yeah, that's going to be it. That's all for this video. So over the last 2 videos, I hope that you've not only learned a lot about how monotone flops should be played, but also I hope you've taken some concepts, some understanding of poker that you can then apply to other situations. And I'll be back next week for a video on turn barreling on 4 flush turns. So once again, it's a relatively rare spot that's probably not been studied a lot. But once again, it's something that plays very differently to any other spot. And once again, it's something where you can take concepts from it that you can then apply elsewhere. So I hope you'll come back for that. And if you're enjoying these videos, I hope that you will consider looking into my advanced No Limit Hold'em 6 Max course that comes out in January. I put an absolute ton of time into the videos, like really a ton of time. And yeah, I wouldn't have done it if I didn't think it was going to bring a lot of value to people who buy it. So yeah, check that out when it comes. Continue watching this free content and make your own minds up about whether you want to buy the course. But yeah, I hope you've enjoyed it, and I'll see you next week.